Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. Today I want to talk to you about a book that is very close to me. As you know by now, I was born and I grew up in Buenosayres, Argentina. But by the time that I moved to the US as a teenager, I had not read a single book by Borges, Cortázar, Bioy, Casares, Sábato, or any of those important authors. If you think of literature as a house, American literature was the first room that I explored, and this is such an ample room that I was quite comfortable in it, and I did not really feel for a long time the need to explore the rest of the house. Argentine literature, if you ask me at that point, to me was the basement of the house. The place where you keep things that you want close at hand, but also out of the way. So that's pretty much the way that I saw it. When I lived in Argentina, I did not have much of an interest for Argentine culture, honestly. I did not listen to rock nacional, I did not watch cine argentino, I did not read Rayuela or any of the short stories by Jorge Luis Borges, but rather I listened to the Ramones and to Guns N' Roses. I watched movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis, and I read adaptations of X-Files episodes, if you can believe that. It was only after I moved to the US that I got nostalgic and I decided to start looking back. And I think in a way what I wanted to do was to reaffirm my identity as an Argentinian. So one day I hanged a blue and white flag here in my room. I got a Soda Stereo CD. I went to Blockbuster and I rented Nueve Reinas, Nine Queens, which is a lot of fun, very good movie if you have not seen it. And also I got a copy of Ernesto Sabato's El Túnel, the tunnel. This, I guess you could say, was my portal into Argentine literature, and at that point I realized that I was ready to go underground and to finally explore that basement. So who was Ernesto Sabato? Let me give you a little bit of information about him. At the risk of simplifying things too much, but just to put things in context, I would call him the humanist of his generation. So he did not write, like Borges, Cortázar, Bioy, Casares, the kind of fiction that is misleadingly called fantastic fiction. He did not do that. To him, literature was not just a ludic act, as it might have been to Cortázar, and maybe a little bit less to Bioy Casares, and it was not an erudite affair either, as it was for Jorge Luis Borges. So, and by the way, this is not a value judgment, okay? I have gone through many phases, and at one point or another, I have called every one of the authors that I have just mentioned my favorite Argentine author. So this is not about value or anything like that. As you know, time has been kind to Borges and to Cortázar. Bioy Casares maybe a little bit less. Okay, I feel like sometimes he is dismissed rather quickly as Borges' buddy, which I think is not entirely fair, because Bioy Casares is an amazing author and one of my favorite authors for sure. But when it comes to Sábato, outside of Argentina, people do not talk about him that much. Okay, and here in the US, I can tell you for sure, if you go to a bookstore, most probably you're not going to find his works. And even at the public library, it's very difficult that you will be able to find anything by Ernesto Sabato, unfortunately. Because back in its time, El Túnel was a Latin American bestseller. Okay, not just an Argentine bestseller, but a Latin American bestseller. Why? If you ask me, for the most part, I would say that one of the reasons why this was so popular in Latin America is that it is not just mere philosophical speculation, and on the other hand, it is not just a literary game, but a story of flesh and blood. For a little bit of context, let me tell you that El Túnel was published in 1948, just like Adán, Buenosayres by Leopoldo Marechal. And I cannot think of two texts that are more different and more in contrast with each other, but let me just invite you to explore that other video that I did on Adán, Buenosayres, one of the great Argentine novels, really. If you look at this one, in this edition by Cátedra that I have, we have a text that is roughly 100 pages in length, and the story is divided into 39 chapters. So it is very brief, quite manageable. And I would not call it a linear narrative exactly. I would say that this is more of an exploration of a specific event, and I would even call it an obsessive self-analysis. Okay, so if you look at the very beginning, right, if you look at the first lines that we have here. This is how the text begins. This is the way the story starts. Bastará decir que soy Juan Pablo Castel, el pintor que mató a María Iribarne. Okay, so in English, basically translating it very quickly, that is not a period, by the way, that is a semicolon, but if you look at the English translation, they translated this as the first sentence. It will suffice to say that I am Juan Pablo Castel, the painter who killed María Iribarne. Look at that beginning. And today, you know, we might say, yeah, big deal, right? We who have read it all in the 21st century, that doesn't really shock us or anything like that. But back in 1948 in Argentina, that was an eye-opening way to begin a story. And the question after this, the obvious question is, how on earth is the narrator going to make the story interesting for the reader after such a revelation, right? We already know that a murder has taken place. There's a book, 1000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari. It's the second part of Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And in that book, Deleuze and Guattari say that for the most part, when we are reading a text, the question that we have in mind is what's going to happen, right? That's why we keep turning the pages, to find out what's going to happen in the story. Now, the novella, and you probably saw this coming, right? Because El Túnel is a novella. In the novella, the question is not so much what's going to happen, but what happened. Okay, past tense. It is a genre that for the most part looks to the past. Okay, the answer sometimes in novellas is not actually provided. Think, for example, of Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Why, what happened, right? Why was Gregor Samsa turned into a gigantic bug, or how did this happen? We really have no idea. You know, we never find out. But in other cases, you do find out what happened, as the question goes. Who was Ivan Ilyich and why is his death important? Or in this case, why was it that Juan Pablo Castel killed María Iribarne? I want to look a little bit at Castel as a protagonist. Okay, interesting name from the start, right? Juan Pablo Castel. Castel as in castle, right? Very ironic, because you think of a castle as something solid, you know, something that has a strong base and everything. And Castel is just completely the opposite of that. This is a very unstable type of character. So you have an ironic name for him right there. And he is spiritual kin to Dostoevsky's Underground Man, also to Juan Carlos Onetti's Eladio Linacero, the character, the protagonist of his first narrative, El Pozo, which was translated into English as The Well. So you can see how we have underground places, right? All of these characters are below, you know, the surface. You can also think of Travis Bickle, the protagonist of Taxi Driver. We are looking at this type of character right here. And the tone of The Tunnel is, believe it or not, even more acerbic than the kind of tone that you will find in American noir. Okay, Castel is not really one of those detached characters, as would be the example of Meursault in Camus' The Stranger. You know, that kind of detachment or anything. You don't have anything like that here. He is just full of hate, full of resentment, you know, full of negative feelings for humanity. And he wants to tell us his story, but actually and honestly, he doesn't really care whether we want to listen to him or not. He just is what he is, and that's pretty much the whole story for him. So the situation here, okay, guy kills lover. What makes this an interesting story, right? It's such a, you know, thing that has been overdone. Why would we find something like this interesting? Castel basically makes sure from the very beginning that we are not reading for plot, right? We are not trying to find out the outcome of the story. That is not going to be our priority, because we already know what's going to happen. At the end, Castel is going to kill María Iribarne. He just told us that in the very first sentence. What we are trying to find out, once again, going back to that central question for the novella, is what happened, right? So what it was that led to that murder, right? The circumstances. So it is, once again, literally impossible, right? Literally impossible to read The Tunnel for plot. You cannot do that. Castel says he does not tell the story out of vanity. He says he might be a little bit proud, he might be a little bit arrogant, but he's not doing this out of vanity. What he is counting on, if you ask me, is on the reader's morbid curiosity. So basically, to read this little book is basically to play Castel's sick game. So what is the theme here? Apparently, Okay, at the first sight, right, what you have is a story of jealousy. There is actually an allusion to Othello here in this book, so clearly you have that theme of jealousy right there. It is about a man who is desperate for connection. He finds that connection with a woman, and then he feels that he must possess this woman completely, because it is the only person who understood him. Juan Pablo Castel, by the way, is a painter. Okay, so was Sábato himself. I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a few minutes. And the connection that he establishes with Maria happens through art. That is the interesting thing about this. Through a painting, actually, that is titled, of all things, Motherhood. You can definitely look for Freudian psychoanalytic things here in the story. There is plenty of that. But there are also discussions about literature, for example. These happen for the most part when Maria is with her friends and Castel happens to be part of the group. They talk about literature. And actually, a little bit of interesting trivia here is that Maria is a reader of Jean-Paul Sartre. She's one of the early readers of Jean-Paul Sartre in literature, because this is once again 1948, so it was a little bit early for characters to be reading Sartre at this point. So ultimately, I would say the main theme of the novella, right, the main theme of The Tunnel, is the human struggle to attain the absolute. Okay, this is a very high-sounding and very important-sounding theme, but that is the central idea: how we try to attain the absolute. Now, Sabato explores his intentions and his goals for writing The Tunnel in a brief little reflection. It's an essay, I would say, but more of a reflection, because it's not long enough, I think, to be called an essay, that he included in a book called Heterodoxia. This volume that you see right here brings together two books, Hombres y Engranajes and Heterodoxia. And in Heterodoxia, he actually has a little reflection, as I said, titled Sobre el túnel, so on the tunnel. I'm going to read you the original in Spanish, and I'll have the translation for you in the screen so that you can hear the original words of Sábato. So he says, mi idea inicial era escribir un cuento, el relato de un pintor que se volvía loco al no poder comunicarse con nadie, ni siquiera con la mujer que parecía haberlo entendido a través de su pintura. Pero al seguir al personaje me encontré con que se desviaba considerablemente de este tema metafísico para, entre comillas, descender a problemas casi triviales de sexo, celos y crímenes. Más tarde comprendí la raíz del fenómeno. Es que los seres de carne y hueso no pueden nunca representar las angustias metafísicas al estado de ideas puras. Lo hacen siempre encarnando esas ideas, oscureciéndolas de sentimientos y pasiones. Los seres carnales son esencialmente misteriosos y se mueven a impulsos imprevisibles, aún para el mismo escritor que sirve de intermediario, entre ese extraño mundo irreal pero verdadero de la ficción y el lector que sigue sus dramas. Las ideas metafísicas se convierten así en problemas psicológicos. La soledad metafísica se transforma en el aislamiento de un hombre concreto en una ciudad concreta. La desesperación metafísica se transforma en celos y el cuento que parecía destinado a ilustrar un problema metafísico se convierte en una novela de pasión y de crimen. So once again, Sabato likes to work with characters of flesh and blood. In this plane of existence, it is impossible for us to attain the absolute, right? Even though we try. The metaphysical impulses basically become translated into ordinary actions and feelings. That is what happens because we are, after all, human. And sometimes that desire for us that we have, right, to attain the absolute here, this side of paradise, I guess you could say, results in disaster. That is what happens to Juan Pablo Castel, and that is why in many cases you have that connection between existentialism and crime. It is the kind of thing that you find in Camus' The Stranger, and also in that famous story by Jean-Paul Sartre, Erostratus, which you can find in that collection, The Wall and other stories. There's also the same idea of crime, right? It's an exploration of that search for meaning, search for the absolute that leads to disaster. So this novella, The Tunnel, has been praised by many critics and by many important authors, and I'm going to read you a couple of assessments of it, and then I'll tell you who wrote them. I am translating here, so this is actually in Spanish originally, but here's one of them. I have great admiration for The Tunnel. for its magnificent psychological analysis. I cannot say that I have read it with pleasure, but I did read it with absolute absorption. Graham Greene, okay? And then the other one. I admired its dryness, its intensity, and I recommended to Gallimard its translation into French. I hope it finds in France the success it deserves. Albert Camus. So we have big names. It was also praised by Thomas Mann. Okay, so great authors actually, said that this was a novel that deserved our attention. The novel was translated into English very quickly, but it went out of print after a few years. And it was in the 80s that it was re-released in a translation that I was able to find here at the library, actually, by Margaret Sayers Peden. Okay, and this is the translation that we have right now. One of the reasons why it was re-released is that there was a film adaptation that I'll give you a little bit of information about in a few seconds. In 2012, the novel was re-released once again as part of the Penguin Classics with a great introduction by Colm Tóibín. So I highly recommend that edition because it's the latest one that we have, and the introduction is really good. Now, as I said before, the novella has been adapted into film many times, at least twice in Argentina, and I think there was even a TV version. And then in 1988, it was actually adapted into a film that is in English, and you would never guess who played Juan Pablo Castel. Peter Weller. Okay, yes, RoboCop. RoboCop played Juan Pablo Castel. And guess who played Maria? She was a Bond girl. Okay, let's see if you know your Bond girls. Bond girl from Live and Let Die. Jane Seymour. Okay, very interesting choice of actors. The movie was actually not well received. It was criticized quite a bit. I saw it and I thought it was very interesting. I did not really see it as an adaptation of the novella. I tried to separate my movies from my written text, and I thought it was all right. But as an adaptation, maybe it's a little bit problematic. So further reading, okay, I would say Sabato's work is definitely worth exploring. He wrote many books of essays, but unfortunately they are not available in English. They have not been translated. Now, Sabato began his career as a scientist, but then at one point he left science for art and literature. So many of his essays deal with that. They deal with the shortcomings of science and the significance, let's put it that way, of art and literature. Those are his essays. But when it comes to fiction, he famously wrote only 3 novels. Okay, you have El Túnel from 1948, Sobre Héroes y Tumbas, on Heroes and Tombs from 1961, and finally, to complete the trilogy, Abaddón, el exterminador, which was translated into English as The Angel of Darkness. A long novel, just as On Heroes and Tombs is this one from 1974. All the novels are interconnected, just so you know, but they can be read individually. There is not a great loss if you decide to read just one of them. On Heroes and Tombs is generally considered to be his masterpiece. It is the story of a family. It's one of those national novels, I guess you could call them, and it bears the clear influence of William Faulkner, okay, in the style. But there's also a third part in that novel. It is divided into 4 parts, the story. And that third section is something completely different. It is a paranoid nightmare, a paranoid fantasy. It's like a descent into hell, okay? So it really stands out. It's titled Informe sobre Ciegos, so the report on the blind. And that part was also adapted into a separate film, which is also very good in Argentina. And then we have the third novel, which is Abaddón, el exterminador. This one is metafiction, and it is also a kind of a literary testament from Sábato. Okay, so it is baroque, it is messy, this guy keeps showing up, and it's just all over the place, okay, but it's really compelling, it is very interesting, and I definitely recommend it. Also, as a final note, Sabato was involved with the commission of the disappeared people in Argentina, the commission that produced that book Nunca Más that I showed you before in my second bookshelf tour. So he was the president of that commission that produced that book that was later submitted to the then president of Argentina, Raúl Alfonsín. So Sabato was just a beloved figure in Argentina, widely respected, right? So very, very important to us. And he was just, he was known for example, just to give you an example of what kind of person he was known to meet with his readers at his house. He also answered fan mail. When I went to Argentina, one of the times that I visited, I tried to meet him, but unfortunately at that time he was already quite old, and I did not get a chance to do that. But I wrote to him once, and he replied. I remember I got the letter on my birthday, so it was really nice of him. Not many authors do that, especially when they are such important authors. A little bit of trivia: he lived almost to be 100 years old. He passed away less than 2 months before his 100th birthday, and the tunnel was celebrated in a Google Doodle that you can look up on the internet. So, another little bit of trivia right there. His house, after he passed away, was turned into a museum that is now open to the public. It is curated by his family, so you can visit the museum and you can see his paintings there, because as I told you before, Sabato was also a painter. You can look up his paintings online. You will notice that they are pretty dark, but readers of Sabato are just not surprised about that. If you read the books as I did, right? I read the books and then I looked at the paintings. You will not be surprised at the darkness, because the two things, right, the visual and the written part of his thought, of his work, they go very closely together. So the bottom line here, when it comes to the tunnel, I would say, please do not let the description of the story, a story of jealousy, a story of a guy who kills his lover, keep you from reading it. Okay, sometimes when you read, even if you take a classic, right, and you describe it, sometimes it doesn't sound like much. There's that book, this reminds me of this, How Proust Can Change Your Life by Alain de Botton, right? I think at one point he says something like, if you take the great works of literature and you describe them as if it were a news article or something like that, right? Bored housewife begins affair. That doesn't mean anything. It's not about the what, it's about the how, basically. And that is the case also with the tunnel. If you describe the story, it doesn't sound like anything. You're like, nah, I don't want to read that. But give it a chance, because it's definitely more. There's definitely more than appears to be at just the surface level. So to appreciate it fully, I think I would say that, or as fully as possible, right? I think you would have to place yourself in the time period and the place, also 1948 in Argentina. And also I would say, please try not to read it as crime fiction, because it doesn't really work very well that way. Maybe as noir, maybe, okay? But I would say try to read it just as this, demented testament, I guess you could call it. So if you want to go for Sabato's masterpiece, I would say that is Sobre Héroes y Tumbas. That is my opinion and the opinion of many critics. So I would go for that. But I would say El Túnel is just so brief. You're looking at 100 pages, and it is referenced in Sobre Héroes y Tumbas. So it really costs nothing to read this book first, and it's the best way to enter Sabato's Inferno. So I would definitely say read El Túnel, then go for Sobre Héroes y Tumbas, and then after that you can decide whether you want to explore The Angel of Darkness or not, because that is a very different type of text. So those are my 2 cents on El Túnel, a great Latin American novella by Ernesto Sabato. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, confessions? You know what to do. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.